Brad, welcome to the Way Champions podcast. I am thrilled to have you on and finally virtually meet you and talk about all your great work in the world of performance.
Thanks, John. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah. We're going to get to your brand new book here, Master of Change. But I think before that, if you can just kind of give our listeners a little bit of an overview of the work you've done and your sort of your career in athletics getting to this point. And obviously we had Steve Magness on, who was co-author of Peak Performance with you. And so they're a little bit familiar with your work, but if you can give everyone just a quick overview, that'd be awesome.
For sure. My personal background in athletics started like so many young boys way back in the day. I grew up in sports were just an enormous part of my identity. My family moved when I was in second grade, and it was a really challenging transition. I got bullied quite a bit as the new kid at this school.
Mm.
And the one thing that I could do really well back then was play soccer and basketball. So for better or worse, that kind of like became how I earned my cred and how I was able to accept myself and be accepted. And over time, I developed a much healthier relationship with sport.
Mm.
I played high school football and basketball, went to school at the University of Michigan, maybe could have walked on, but chose not to take that path as a walk-on football player. So that was the end of my competitive career. But since then, as an armchair athlete, have gone on a 10-year journey in endurance sports, doing triathlon, and then more recently got back to my roots in powerlifting and strength training. So sport is a very big part of my own life, my own personal practice, how I strive for excellence as an overall person myself. And then my research, writing, and coaching really centers around what I call sustainable excellence, which I've come to define as doing good and feeling good over the long haul. And a large part of that work has been with athletes, both as an advisor and then also as the aggregator of research and studies and patterns in trying to unlock keys to sustainable excellence in an athletic domain. So lots of athlete stories in this book, and as your listeners might know, in my prior books with Steve.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I mean, I was kind of going back and forth of where to begin. Like, what do I ask you first because of this? But maybe how did you get from Peak Performance to Practice of Groundedness, your last book, to then, Master of Change? It seems like they're all related to each other, obviously. And your work is also based in like a lot of the stuff that we talk about on here in Eastern philosophy and Eastern thought and Buddhism and things like that as well. It's this sort of melding of the West and East, which Jerry has been on for 50 plus years now. Talk about that evolution. Like, how did this book come out of the others?
Well, I think that peak performance is really about what happens when you're on the top of the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And I was younger when I wrote that book. I mean, we started working on that book almost a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that book had a lot of mind and brain, but maybe not a lot of heart and soul.
Mm-hmm.
And that book is really clinical and scientific. I think that's why it's done so well. And it's so defensible, the concepts and the practices in that book.
Mm-hmm.
But as I've gotten older, I realized that, the clinical pursuit of peak performance at the top of the mountain is really only one part of the game. And it's actually a pretty small part.
Mm-hmm.
I love the metaphor of a mountain because you think about a mountain and the peak makes up like almost none of its surface area, yet we spend so much time looking up toward it. And I think the practice of groundedness was my attempt to say, hey, there is no peak without a solid foundation. A mountain is only as strong as its base. It's the base that gets it through all kinds of rough weather patterns. And the same thing is true for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then this book is about navigating the weather and all the change that we experience as individuals while we strive for performance. So the external winds that blow and the internal storms that we confront that are really not the exceptions, but the norms.
Mm-hmm.
I was really struck by this work that shows that the average adult in America experiences over 35 major life disruptions.
Mm.
And at first I said, no, that can't be. But then you start looking at the anthropological research here and the examples, and it's like, of course, we move, we start new jobs, we finish jobs, we get promoted, we get demoted, we get laid off. We win medals, we lose medals. We start educational programs, we graduate. We get married. Maybe if we're unlucky, we get divorced. We have kids, kids leave the house, and just on and on and on. And I'm someone that really likes stability. I'm an athlete. I like to have a program and a plan and stick to it. So
Mm-hmm.
change is hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I try to write the book that I need and write the book
Yeah.
for myself first, and then hopefully it becomes valuable for other people. So this was a book that I couldn't avoid. And I'll give you the real kernel that was like, I'm going to write a book on this. And
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about change quite a bit, because in my own personal life in the last 5 years, I just undergone a lot of change. We moved across the country, had my first child, had a second child, had major orthopedic surgery on my leg that pretty much ended my endurance sports career. Left the corporate world to really give this a go as a full-time writer and coach.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of personal change going on. And then, of course, there's the pandemic, which is the big change that impacted all of us. And I distinctly remember one morning I was in my kitchen on my wife's iPad, because I don't have my own, and just reading various headlines in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist, left, right, down the middle, doesn't matter. They're all running stories about when will we get back to normal.
Yeah.
And there was something about that just struck me as like off, and I didn't know what, but I just had this visceral reaction to this thought of back to normal amidst all this disorder. And I remember going to Google Scholar and just saying like history of change, and then just went down this intellectual rabbit hole of trying to understand why we think about change the way we do, and where it came from, and what we can do with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. A couple of thoughts that pop up. I like this analogy of the peak, because also for anyone who has climbed a mountain, or I do a lot of. I live in the mountains of Oregon and do ski mountaineering and stuff. There's also many false peaks. Like you think you're there, and then you're not. And I like that thing too. Is like, there's the goal. Oh no, we're not there yet, right? And I also think about this idea. I remember when I was reading your book and I came across that same statistic of the 35 major changes. And I did what probably most people do, is you start counting them. You start going through your head, and because you're like 35, and then you start going through it and you're like, yeah, I'm getting there, and so it's really, really interesting. We talk all the time on this podcast about this idea of, we just tend to use the word impermanence, right?
That's right.
But that would be sort of the Buddhist term or whatever, or this idea that everything is always moving. And when we cling to homeostasis, when we cling to stability, that's when we're constantly disappointed, because we're not looking forward and moving forward. We're trying to keep the status quo. Thoughts on that?
That's right. I also think of it as impermanence, though I was really somewhat surprised to find, when I went into the deep history of change, that even in more Western traditions, there was a real acceptance of change in the ancient wisdom philosophies. So the Greek philosopher Heraclitus has this really profound quote that we cannot step into the same river twice.
Yeah.
And the river he was talking about was our identity, our sense of self.
Yeah.
That like we're always changing.
Yeah.
The Stoics often get a rap is being really planful and bend the world to will and focus on what you can control. But there's also a lot in Stoicism about accepting all that you can't control, which of course is the serenity prayer in Christianity. So as someone that has an Eastern philosophical bent, I was pleasantly surprised to see that it's actually not just Eastern philosophy, it's Western philosophy too. And you're right. In modern scientific terms, I think what we're really talking about is the difference between like a homeostatic approach to life and an allostatic approach to life.
Yeah. Can you explain
so
that?
Homeostasis says that living systems really like stability, and we don't like change. And whenever there's change or disruption and we lose stability, the goal is to resist that and to get back to where we started as fast as possible. So it describes a cycle in very simplified terms of order, disorder, order. Whereas allostasis describes a cycle of order, disorder, reorder. And what allostasis says is, yeah, it's true. Living systems do like stability, but that stability is always somewhere new and it's always reinventing itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the etymology of the word allostasis is allo, which means variable, and stasis, which means standing. So
Mm-hmm.
it's literally like stability through change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so beautiful because it has this double meaning, which is the way to be stable through change is by changing, at least to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was kind of the intellectual aha that gave me the scientific grounding to realize that like there's probably a book here, or at least really worth exploring. Homeostasis has been around since the mid 1800s, and it was only in the early 2000s that this notion of allostasis became widely accepted in the research community is
Yeah.
a better, more accurate model for change. In sports science, allostasis is starting to really be widely accepted.
Right.
But when we think about change more broadly, we're just so stuck in like this homeostasis mindset. And I'm trying to disrupt it a little bit with this book.
Yeah, no, it's great. When I read your book, I thought about, and I know, David Epstein's a friend and supporter of yours. And I remember him telling me once, he's like, I like to write books about what people talk about at cocktail parties, but they really have no idea what they're talking about. Right. So it's a topic of conversation that always comes up, but people really aren't sure. They just feel something or think something. And I think this book is one of those, because again, we're all undergoing these changes, but really, what is it, and what's the best path? Do you fight it? Do you push back? Do you embrace it? Do you move forward? And how do you do that without losing agency? Right? It's not just give it over to the fates either, right? So how do you do that? How do you balance that? Maintaining a semblance of agency and control, and at the same time accepting what's happening and unfolding before you.
Yeah, I mean, you said it in the way that you posed the question. You used the word and. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that a lot of the problem is that people often think of these two extremes as either or.
Yeah.
So either we're going to cling to agency and control, or we're going to completely let go and leave it to the fate.
Mm-hmm.
And successfully navigating change requires both.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be really strong and robust and durable and cultivate those qualities. And at the same time, we have to be really flexible. So the term that I use in the book is rugged flexibility.
Yeah, I love this term. It's great.
We need to be both rugged and flexible. And when you think about the grandest example of change that at least science has been able to identify, which is evolution,
Mm-hmm.
and you think about what makes a species persist and endure, so at a species level, and what evolutionary biologists always come back to is species that are really gritty and are able to weather change. They have this mix of two qualities. On the one hand, they have what scientists call central features,
Mm-hmm.
which are these things that they really hold on tight to. That if those central features changed, the species would no longer be the same thing. It would be unrecognizable.
Mm-hmm.
So they have these central features that are their source of ruggedness that they don't let go of.
Mm-hmm.
But then everything else is really flexible. And how they apply those central features also changes over time. And we can take something like evolution that is so grand and then think about what does it mean for us as an individual on our own performance path or throughout our own life. I think it's kind of the same. Like it is important to have some central features
Mm-hmm.
and to have some values that are somewhat robust to change that we can carry with us. But we also need to be able to cultivate the flexibility to apply those values and to practice those values differently over time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one key point. And then I think another really important point on this is, you use the word agency. And I also think that that's right, that for just about 99% of things that we're confronted with, we never have as much control as we think,
Mm-hmm.
but we also often have more control than we think.
Mm-hmm.
And both those things can be true at the same time. So it's about applying agency and not just surrendering, but also surrendering so you don't over apply agency and you don't over control.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, like this is what just about every wisdom practice is pointed toward.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think of, when you think of the practice of mindfulness and whatever, I mean, again, we struggle to control our own thoughts. God forbid we're trying to control others as well, right? Other people's thoughts as well. And so I think this idea of rugged flexibility, I really loved those two words together. And so does it start with this idea of getting really crystal clear on your why or your core values, like your identity. Is that kind of how you see it? Like, is that the first thing we need to do? Like these non-negotiable principles of life?
I think so. And I think that we each have our own set. So there's not one set fits all by any means. So back to this Heraclitus quote, right? We can't step into the same river twice. And Bruce Lee famously said, be like water.
Yeah.
So there's this enduring metaphor of a river for identity and the process of becoming. But what none of these philosophers are talking about is that without a bank, a river would just be random water.
Mm-hmm.
So part of what makes a river is it has a bank, it has boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our core values serve as the boundaries to our identity.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we're going to change, we're going to flow over time, but the direction we go can be guided by our core values.
Mm-hmm.
And just so I'm not talking in any ambiguity, the way that I define core values are aspirational attributes, qualities, characteristics that when we are practicing them, we're achieving our own version of success or excellence.
Mm-hmm.
These can be things like creativity, health, relationships, love, intellect, wisdom, spirituality. There's hundreds of potential core values. But once we have these core values, we can take them with us wherever we go. And when change occurs, either within us or around us, we can ask ourselves, well, what would it look like to practice my core values in the midst of this change?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I think our core values are in many ways the tool that gets us from disorder to reorder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, this is a podcast, athletes and coaches, and I have that conversation a lot with coaches when they're, have an obstacle in their way, when they're not sure, can I continue working in this current environment I'm in? And oftentimes they're put in a situation where it's violate or sacrifice my core values and things that I stand for in order to keep my job or navigate this situation. And what I almost always see happening is they violate all their principles and they eventually lose their job anyway. And now you have nothing to go back on, right? Because you've given up who you are and you've lost the work. Is this, you do a lot of individual coaching, athletes, business. I mean, do you have the same conversation?
I do. And I think that, there's so many layers of nuance here. I think it is okay to be asked to practice your core values differently.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is okay to be asked to emphasize some core values over others.
Mm-hmm.
If you are asked to completely go against them or to let go of them or to relinquish them,
Mm-hmm.
then that is not an organization that you are going to be happy at. To your point, it's probably not an organization you're going to last at.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you leave, you make the short-term sacrifice for long-term disorientation and discombobulation. So I think that values alignment is one of the most important things for coaches and for athletes that are deciding on, if they have the luxury to decide like whom to coach or what program to join.
Mm-hmm.
And not just values that are posters on a wall, but values that really lead to day-to-day practices and decision-making.
Mm-hmm.
So you can value integrity and ethics and then run a international doping program. And I don't care what your poster says, like,
right.
So it's really about values first organizations
Mm-hmm.
that lead with those values.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I always say to teams that I work with, like, I don't want to see your values on the wall. I want to watch you practice. And then I should be able to tell you what you value, right? Because if I'm not seeing them in action, then like you said, it's a nice poster. Yep. And it looks good and it's a great web page, but it's bull. It's just not true. And now you're not living in alignment at that point, Go ahead.
Happens in our personal lives all the time too. I was just to say, like, so many people immediately say they value family, but then they can't put their phone down when they're with their significant other or their kids. And it's like, well, do you really value family? And maybe you really do, but then like it's hard work to align the behaviors with what you value.
Mm-hmm.
But that's ultimately, I think, like that's the ground we stand on, right? Our values and how we act on them. Mm-hmm. That is our source of ruggedness throughout all the change that life throws our way.
Right.
And once we release from those, then in many ways we're literally releasing from the ground that we stand on, and that can be a really disorienting position.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, your last book, Practice of Groundedness, was about that. I think your was sort of presence over productivity. And I know I struggle with that as a business owner, and maybe you do as well. And I have two children as well. And it's like trying to be where my feet are, or is one of the hardest things to do. And when you're not, then you're at home thinking about work, and then you're at work wishing you were better at home. And this is a massive struggle for, I think, people in the sports coaching world, because it's very easy to never put work away, or it's easy to come home and watch more film and do that, and then you're gone. Your spouse, your kids, you're totally disconnected all the time.
There's always more that you can do when you're committed to excellence in a specific domain. So I think that it's really important to have sharp boundaries and constraints to know this about yourself. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it does any good to judge yourself and say like, oh, I'm a crappy husband or I'm a crappy father because I don't put my phone away. No, you're not. You're not putting your phone away because you're a really good coach and you want to be a really good father, and it's hard to be both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one area where I think like having some pretty steadfast rules. It could be that every night I put my phone away between 6:30 and 8:30 for dinner and story time. It could be every weekend I have a half day or a day when my phone is put away.
Mm.
And at first this can like be a source of great anxiety because you worry about all the things that you're missing. But ultimately, most people realize that others respect those boundaries, and it does allow you to be more present.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so much presence over productivity. I would argue that it's I think in the book what I wrote is productive activity over productivity. So productivity, like rote productivity, is doing stuff, like flying down that checklist. Whereas productive activity is a term coined by the great humanist Erich Fromm that basically says being intentional, doing meaningful things, and doing them with respect, concentration, and love.
Yeah.
And
whatever aspect of your life. Yeah.
Bingo. If you want to throw your time and energy into that, that is great. I think the problem is when we get into like productivity trap or a loop of just doing stuff. And that has a real inertia behind it. And I think that all of this stuff is an ongoing practice. These aren't just switches that we can flip.
Yeah. Awesome. Before we get into the meat of the book, you make this distinction between a road and a path. And I really enjoyed this, and I read it a couple times, and I underlined it and stuff because I was thinking about this, because we often use those words interchangeably, but really mastering change is about taking sort of a path mentality and not a road mentality. So can you break that one down as well? Because I think that's important foundation for our talk here.
So a road aims to get you from here to there as fast as possible, and a road plows through the environment. If there's a mountain in the way, it blows up the mountain to create a tunnel. Mm-hmm. If there's water, it creates a bridge. And anytime you're traveling on a road, if you get knocked off the road, you immediately get back on it. That's what you do. You get on a road, you're looking at your GPS, you're looking at the clock on the car. You want to get from here to there as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. A path is one with its environment. And in many ways, a path is unfolding as you walk it. And when you're on a path, there are multiple ways to get where you're going. And you really have to pay attention to what's happening around you, because new opportunities are going to present themselves all the time, and you might want to take those new opportunities. Mm-hmm. If you're really an adventurer, if you're on a mountain, like you bushwhack, you literally sometimes create the path as you go. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is such a trap of viewing our careers, viewing the performance aspects of our life, viewing our life as a whole as this road, like to get from here to there, graduate, take assistant coaching job, take director of performance, take head coaching job, just linear. And one, it puts a lot of undue pressure on ourselves to get to our destination by a certain time. And the other is that we might miss out on all this interesting stuff that happens on the side. Mm-hmm. And when you're on a road and there's change and you get knocked off the road, it's like this terrifying experience. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you view your process of becoming as a path, well, there really is no getting knocked off a path. And that sounds like a little bit woo-woo, but it's true. Mm-hmm. Or if you're knocked off the path, at least it's a lot less of a crisis than being knocked off the road. And I know that you have, as you mentioned, like an Eastern tilt. So there's this beautiful concept out of the martial art Aikido. Mm-hmm. And it's called Zanshin.
Okay.
And I'm going to get to Zanshin, but first I want to talk about its opposite, which is target fixation.
Okay.
Now, target fixation is a term that was born out of aviation science, so like airplane pilots, but is now widely adopted for any kind of vehicular transportation. And it basically says that sometimes when you get so focused on a target, you crash into it.
Mm-hmm.
And this explains the phenomena of crashes on the shoulder of a road.
Mm.
Pile-ups on the shoulder, because it never starts as a pile-up. It's always a small crash. And then everyone's like looking at the pile-up because they don't want to hit it. And then sometimes they get so transfixed by it, they drive right into it.
Mm-hmm.
So in driving, they teach you when there's a crash on the shoulder, you want to see it with a soft view, but you actually don't want to stare at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that target fixation is a risk not only for driving, but for all of our goals in life.
Mm-hmm.
We can get so focused on a target and get such blinded tunnel vision that we just plow right into it. And we miss out on everything that happens along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we cause great disaster when we do so.
Mm-hmm.
So the martial art Aikido recognizes this. And it has this counter, which is called Zanshin, which is basically a soft attention that realizes the goal and realizes the next move, but it also asks you to consider everything that's happening around you and to constantly ask yourself, hey, am I on the right path towards that target? Or should I actually step off? Should I go a little bit more to the right, a little bit more to the left? And I think that, it's very similar to a road versus a path. I think a road, you have target fixation. A path, you can have this softer awareness. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
I think it's great. And as you're talking about shoulder of the road, I just think about, again, being a snow skier, and the advice when you're skiing trees is don't look at the trees, look at the space between the trees. Because when you look at a tree, you're going to hit the tree.
You hit the tree. That's it. I mean, that's target fixation to a T. And in many cases, it can be the coach that is just so focused on the head coaching role or the championship or whatever it is. And you just miss out on all these interesting opportunities along the way. And then even if you get there, you just kind of pummel into it. And that never feels really good either. I'm reminded of Ray Allen, the great NBA basketball shooter, who in his memoir talks about how the day after he won his first championship was just one of the worst days of his life. Because he thought that by winning this championship, by having this goal that in his own words, he was so obsessed with, he'd find joy and happiness. And he actually kind of felt empty after. And that led to such a transformation for him, because in his second championship, the one that he won with the Heat, he was just enjoying the path. And it was such a more fulfilling experience. So it's this great paradox. He was less obsessed with the goal, and as a result, enjoyed the achievement of it that much more.
I can't tell you how many coaches that we've had on this podcast who have won multiple championships would say the same thing, that if all you do is win the championship, if that's your only goal, it's empty. It's totally hollow. And even after you win, the feeling goes away pretty soon. Right. But if you focus on the journey and the relationships and the camaraderie and all those things, then it's lasting. Then it sticks, because that's what you remember. You remember the locker room or the bus or the thing, not the moments of the match or the game. And it's so important. I also think I've been thinking, as you were talking about this road versus path, the thing that my mind went to was parents in sport, that we often treat our kids' journey as a road and not a path. And if it's a road and there's an obstacle, well, we need to clear the obstacle, right? And we need to plow it or whatever, instead of, if you're walking down the path through the woods and the tree's down, you climb over it or you go around it or whatever, and you learn and you enjoy those moments. And yes, they're difficult and struggle, but I think this is a really interesting thing that I hadn't thought of in reading the book. But when you said that, talk about that for a second, that parents' target fixation on whatever they want for their child all of a sudden turns this, what can be a beautiful youth sport journey, into a road that is clear the obstacles, get rid of the coaches, other parents, teammates, clubs that are in the way of whatever I'm fixated on.
And it often ends up in a terrible crash on the shoulder.
It really does.
The kid burns out or needs a Tommy John surgery at age 9.5.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's real. And I think that happens. And I think it takes a lot of intention and effort to hold yourself back as a parent. Because you want your kid to do well and you want your kid to have confidence and you want your kid to perform. And it's easy to forget that your kid is a kid
Mm,
and your kid should be having fun. And we now know, thanks to a lot of research, that the best chance that your kid actually has to perform is to have fun. Because
hmm
if they're not enjoying it, odds are they're going to burn out. I mean, there are so many prodigies that probably could have been world class that we don't know their names
hmm
because there was this intense target fixation starting from age 5. And
hmm
then by age 14 or 15, those kids were either burnt out psychologically or physically. Their bodies were just completely run down.
hmm
So yeah, I think that this view of a road versus a path is really important. And then I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction for a second here where we talk about kids. And you mentioned Dave Epstein, who's a close friend of mine. I know you know Dave well as well. He wrote this excellent book called Range, right? Which
hmm
was really prominently discussed in the sporting community that basically takes all this research that shows that the best athletes tend to not specialize until much later in their career. They tend to
hmm
be generalists. They tend to play a bunch of sports. And Dave was really focused on performance. And in my book, I step back and I build on Dave's work. And I actually say, like, how do you have a solid identity as an athlete?
Yeah.
Knowing that any athletic career is full of so many abrupt changes.
hmm
You get injured, you age, you have great races, you have bad races. It is just this whirlwind. And I think that another trap that parents fall into is you can get so hyper focused on sport at such a young age that that kid's entire identity becomes that sport.
hmm
And then when change happens in that sport,
Which is inevitable.
inevitable, the kid completely loses a sense of themselves and can be wholly disorienting.
hmm
So the way that I think of it is it's really helpful to have multiple components of an identity.
hmm
So you can almost think of identity like a house. And it's so important to be robust and anti-fragile and rugged and flexible to have different rooms in your house.
hmm
So yes, you can have the athlete room, but also have, if we're talking about kids, the Pokemon room or the brother room or the friend room or the joker room or the person that loves reading room. And as we age, it's not to say that we need to be balanced across all these rooms. It's simply to say that we should never shut all the doors except for one.
hmm
Because what ends up happening is when things go poorly in the one room that we're really spending all our time on, that we're focused on, if we have other rooms available, we can lean on those rooms and spend time in there for some stability
hmm
to get through the change in the other area.
hmm
Whereas if our whole identity gets compressed to this one area, well, when that area changes, then it is a really rough disorder period. So
Yeah.
I think like the two most important things for parents are, I love how you took the path versus a road and applied it to youth sport. But I also think it's just make sure that you as a parent have multiple components to your identity that give you meaning, that help you know who you are. And I want to be really clear. It's not to say you need to be balanced and spend equal time in each, but you got to have multiple options because if you
hmm
run out of options, when change happens, it can become very scary very fast.
Well, there are a lot of parents, and it's easy, but they get their identity tied up in their child's athletic performance, right? Much more so than their school performance. Because if our kid gets straight A's, we tend to hide that. If our kid, hits 4 home runs, we tend to celebrate that publicly. But so many parents because I think a lot of times, like the athletes who make it almost have their own target fixation. And as the parent, you're sort of the facilitator and the balancer and sort of trying to, like when I talked to like Christian Pulisic's dad, he talked about how many times him and his wife just said no. They
Yeah, you
said
got to
no,
hold your kid back.
holding
Yeah.
your kid back because they have the target fixation. But the problems arise when someone decides I'm going to be the next Earl Woods and it's their target fixation, which is not matched by young Tiger. Right. And then the kid goes off the rails because it was never their dream or their goal or whatever. And, in peak performance, I mean, high level of performance is so hard, and there's so many things that you have to sacrifice and give up if it's not your goal, if it's not your path. And so I see parents getting tied up in that identity, and then the first thing when you talk to them about that, because I have these conversations and I say, and this is something I think you talk about in this book, or maybe in your last book, this idea of go slow, arrive sooner, right? We're in such a hurry to get there that, and then you mention that to them, they say, well, that's not my kid. It's all driven by her. It's all driven by him. And you're like, and yeah, and I've had 100 of those same conversations and 99 of them
right?
ended up in the same place. Right. And it's
Yeah.
not a good place where you're thinking your kid's going to end up. And it's sad, but it's hard to convince people that they're on the wrong path until they're standing in the doctor's office talking about Tommy John surgery for their 12-year-old.
Yeah. So I want to do two things. I want to show empathy for those parents.
Because you are one.
Right. And then I want to talk a little bit about the speed skater, Niels van der Poel, who I profile in the book.
Yeah.
So first, empathy. My almost 6-year-old son got so into basketball about a year ago.
Mm.
And I'll tell you what, like, there is not a 5-year-old in North Carolina that has a better jump shot than Theo. Mm-hmm. It was insane. Like, neighbors, I mean, the kid just is a natural. He can shoot a basketball at age 5, like, consistently. Even when he misses, it's the same shot. Mm-hmm. And he was so into it. And we played so much basketball. He's outside, he's moving. And then about 5 months ago, he discovered Pokemon.
Nice.
And let me tell you, it's an active game because they do it all make-believe. So, like, it's not like they're on their phones. They're just chasing imaginary things throughout the neighborhood. No interest in basketball. And it is so hard for me and my wife, who was never even an athlete growing up, to not constantly be like, you sure you don't want to play basketball? You want to play basketball? Maybe we should play a game of horse. Let's play basketball. Now, if he was, like, not outside moving, then it'd be a little bit different. But no, like, he's just not into it right now. And what I want to say is I'm very proud of us because we haven't pressured him to play basketball. And it has been so hard to show that restraint. So I empathize with those parents because I don't see my kid as being a D1 athlete and getting my identity through him. But what I think is, like, it's a great sport. It's good for your confidence. You're good at it. I want you to do this thing that you're good at. But to your point, like, one, he's a freaking kid. He doesn't even know he's good at it.
He's 5. I mean, I think 30
doesn't
years
even
ago...
know he doesn't even know he's good at it. He's a 5-year-old, right?
Right, exactly.
He has no idea that he's good at it, and it's got to come from him. But the reason I tell this story is because it takes effort for me not to push and not to press, which I know sounds insane, but I think that it's better to admit that than to be like, kind of saying, oh, I wouldn't do that. And then in the back of your mind, like, go play, go play, go play. You must play. So that's the first thing is I want to empathize because we can talk about this intellectually, but then when the rubber meets the road, it can still be a challenge to show that restraint and to do the right thing. All right, identity diversification. I want to tell the story of Niels van der Poel because I think it's really profound. So for those that don't know, I'm sure many listeners will. Niels van der Poel is the recent gold medalist at the 2022 Winter Games in the 10K and 5K speed skating. And shortly after winning the second gold medal, he released this PDF on the internet that was called How to Skate a 10K and a 5K. And the endurance sports community went nuts over this. Everyone thought it was going to be like the recipe of his training. Yeah. And it did contain a whole bunch of training, but there was multiple sections that were basically like a philosophical manifesto of his journey to being the best in the world. Best ever. He set a world record. So the best ever at the time. And van der Poel, around age 23, 24, realized with such astute maturity that his entire life and his entire identity was in speed skating. And before big competitions, he would be overcome with fear. And he put 2 and 2 together. And he said, the reason I'm overcome with fear and I'm underperforming is because this is all that I have. So in the lead up to the 2022 games, van der Poel did something that is relatively unthinkable in high level sport, which is he took 2 days off a week. Not only did he take 2 days off, but he had a proper weekend. He says, I got friends that are accountants, that are in finance, that are teachers. They go out for beers and pizza. They go bowling. They go on hikes. I'm going to start doing that. Like, I'm going to stop saying, no, I need to recover, or no, I need to train. I'm going to have a proper weekend. And Vanderpool said how shocked he was to realize that he could have fun. You know, elite athletes, like they live like a monastic life.
Mm-hmm.
So he went out for pizza, he went out for beers, he had fun, he developed other sources of meaning and identity in his life other than speed skating.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this line in his document where he says, more than anything, I shed my fear. I was no longer scared.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to have the best two performances of his life.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be clear, Vanderpool was still training 35, 40 hours a week. You know, Monday through Friday, he was training insane volumes and intensities.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like, you know, he gave up training hard, but what he gave up was just having his sense of self be wrapped up in sport.
Mm-hmm.
And what it allowed him to do was to shed the fear, perform from a place of trying to play to win instead of playing not to lose.
Mm-hmm.
And then after he won the medals, he didn't have like the typical post games depression,
Mm-hmm.
because he said, I got this great life. I got
Mm-hmm.
these friends. I got these activities I do. And I just think that is such a poignant story, because the number one thing that people will say is, you know, Brad, you and John can sit here and talk all day and this is all woo woo, but like, have you seen The Last Dance with Michael Jordan? You have to be obsessed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one archetype, and it's an archetype in a lot of documentaries because we're drawn to it. But there are other ways to get to greatness.
Mm-hmm.
And Niels Vanderpool wasn't great in spite of developing other parts of his identity beyond being a speed skater. He was great because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is just such a profound story and shows an alternative path to greatness.
And this word fear is, you know, Jerry calls it, you know, it's the cancer of the athletic soul, right? And you know,
Ooh, I've never
fear,
heard that, but that's true.
yeah, you know, it is. And performance, as he said, you know, when you get to the day of your race or your match, performance is 100% mental, right? It's all there. And if you have fear and you know, if I lose, what was this all for? Right? I lose my identity, I lose everything. You're never going to perform freely. But by adding these other aspects to his life, he was able to see more, and therefore he didn't come into the race with fear. He came in relaxed and not tense and not tentative and all that, and performs his best. And I think that's one of the things is, you know, it's okay to be nervous. You're supposed to. It means you care, right? But it's also, by the same token, if you're paralyzed by fear because your whole identity is caught up in this, especially if you're an Olympic sport where you get 1 minute every 4 years, right? That's just too much. It breaks most people.
Yeah. And I think you can take that all the way back to, you know, Johnny or Amy, the 14-year-old, you know, shortstop or pitcher, baseball, softball player, what have you. And if their whole source of love from their parents is the sport, they're going to probably be carrying a lot of fear.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, if anything, for the parent that is really mature and does hold their driven kid back, in addition to holding their driven kid back, I'd encourage them to make sure that their kid has other sources of meaning and other sources of identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say, again, I keep coming back to this too. I want to be explicit. I sound like a broken record. It's not to say that you need to separate your eggs across 8 different baskets. You can put all your eggs in one basket. You just have to have the other ones available to shift when the time comes.
Yeah, 100%. So we talked about, you know, you break the book into sort of 3 parts: rugged mindset, rugged identity, and rugged actions. I think we kind of just talked a lot about identity there. What do you mean by rugged mindset, and how does that apply to managing change?
Yeah, so a rugged and flexible mindset has 2 really important components. The first is to accept change is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds so simple, but you know, so often we don't accept change. And the more that we fight it, the harder it becomes. There's this shorthand equation that I use in the book, which is suffering equals pain times resistance.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
And change can be painful because, again, human species, we do like stability. That is true. But the more that we resist the pain, the more that we suffer. So it's just accepting change when it happens. When it's good change, it's easy to accept. But when it's not so good change, we still have to accept it nonetheless. We have to say, like, hey, this is what's happening right now. And then the second part of this is expecting change.
Mm-hmm.
So this was one of the more intellectually interesting parts of the book for me, because like I find the science on consciousness really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And the latest neuroscience, at least one way, I want to be careful, it's not to say the only way, but a very valid way to conceive of the brain is that it's a prediction machine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's constantly making predictions for what's going to happen next. And when reality is aligned with those predictions, we kind of coast on autopilot. It feels really good.
Mm-hmm.
But when our predictions are off and reality is different, it causes distress.
Mm-hmm.
There's fascinating, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds, like computational science on consciousness that literally shows it takes our brain more energy to make sense of the world when our expectations aren't met.
Yeah, for sure.
And we evolved to conserve energy, so we don't like that. So change is by definition our expectations not being met.
Mm-hmm.
We're expecting things to happen one way and then boom, something changes.
Mm-hmm.
The quicker that we can update our expectations to match the reality that we're in, the more we get back on the path, the less that we suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So an example of this that I write about in the book is during the pandemic, I wrote this piece for the New York Times that basically said, we can look to endurance athletes to learn some skills about how to run a marathon, because it looks like we're in for a marathon. And I don't want to minimize the suffering of the pandemic. Like, it is significantly greater for many people than any voluntary effort. And I wrote this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't to equate the two. It's simply to say, there are some things that we can keep in mind. I talked about patience and pacing and running the mile that you're in and eating and drinking and having social support and all these metaphors. And I got this email from a reader that said, I really liked your piece, but I think you were wrong about one big thing. And I actually think the pandemic is more like an ultra marathon where we don't know where the finish line is. And that got me thinking, like, that's kind of what life is like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what do the best ultra runners do? And I talked to them. They constantly let go of their expectations for how they thought the race was going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And they just live in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And they expect at the start line that they are going to go through dark places. And then they don't freak out when they get there. There's like, of course, here's the dark spot. It doesn't mean it's going to be here forever. I might feel like this is going to be forever, but if I eat, drink, if I focus on my process, I'll probably get through it. Mm-hmm. But because they have that expectation, when it happens, they don't freak out. Mm-hmm. And then when something goes awry, instead of resisting it and saying, oh, well, I didn't expect that I was going to have gut issues, or I didn't expect that my legs were going to start to give out as early as mile 44, they immediately adjust. And they're like, well, this is the reality. My legs are giving out. I am having gut issues. What can I do as a result? So those two things, accepting change when it happens, and then realigning our expectations with reality. And they go hand in hand.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, expecting that it will happen, right? Like this is what I talk about with the teams I work with all the time. Do we actually think we're going to go through this season where there's not a bad call against us? Where there's not, where the other team doesn't go on a run and score a couple goals or whatever? Of course it's going to happen. So let's train it. Let's expect it. Let's make sure that we don't go into panic mode and go, oh yeah, no, hey, of course this happened, right? So let's just respond to this and not react and freak out. And I think that's one of the most important things. And I think, for athletes, then that mindset helps you deal with, what did I learn when we won? What did I learn when we lost? Right? What did I learn when I got injured? What did we learn?
I was just going to say, I'm so glad you said that. Sorry to interject, but injury.
Yeah.
Injury. Like, of course, if you are going to have a long athletic career, you're going to be injured.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you have to like it. Doesn't mean when it happens, you should be like, yay, like I checked my injury box.
Right.
No, but having an expectation and having mentors and coaches set that as an expectation that, hey, you are on this long path and there will be periods of injury. And during those periods, it is going to feel like your athletic world at least, is falling apart. And it might feel like you're never going to get back to how you were. And guess what? Everyone that sustains a pretty significant injury feels that way.
Yeah.
So we're going to do everything we can to prevent it. But there's a pretty good chance it's going to happen. And imagine if every athlete kind of went into their career knowing that. Well, then when they got injured, they wouldn't waste as much time resisting or denying or engaging in magical thinking. It's like, all right, like now it's time to deal with this thing that has happened to me.
I just, I think of the videos of that athlete who comes back from the ACL a year later and then boom, does it again. And you just see the agony in them because they know what they just went through. But then they also know, like, the sooner I get over this and just accept it, and okay, what comes next is the key to getting better, right? That's when you stop being injured and start getting healthy. And I think it's so important because I see so many athletes, they get injured, they fall behind, right? And the statistics also tell us that that's when a lot of them quit, right?
Yep.
Because they try to come back. And I think one of our
Or
problems,
they overcompensate, right? They try to come back way too fast
pull
and then blow
back way too
themselves up.
fast. Well, this is the thing, I think, with a lot of big injuries like an ACL, your orthopedic at 6 months, 8 months, 9 months says you're healthy, but you're not healthy here. Right. And the game has, you're not healthy with the speed of the game or whatever. And so I'm always talking to people about, like, listen, it's awesome that you're back here, but please be patient, because it really takes a year and a half or 2 years to get back from this. Not, one of the best player, we have the Women's World Cup going on as we're speaking. And, Alexia Putellas from Spain, she's just started her first game in the World Cup in the semifinals. But she's really struggling. She was a 2-time player of the year until she tore her ACL. But it's only been 9 months. Right. And everyone's like, wow, she's only 9 months out of an ACL injury. Like, she's going to be back. She's just back really early to play in the World Cup. So,
yeah. And they said the commentators said the same thing about Klay Thompson. Following his what was it, an ACL and then
an Achilles, I think, right?
Achilles,
yeah.
And then Kevin Durant did an Achilles, and then was it an MCL or maybe another Achilles? But like, everyone said the same thing, right? Like, it's gone, and it's not gone. Both those guys are back, and both there's a different reorder. Back to order, disorder, reorder. Like, their game has changed. It is different. They're aging. They've had major orthopedic surgeries, so they've had to adapt their game. But they're still back, and they're still performing at the highest level, and they're still having fun, hopefully doing the thing that they loved. In the book, I also tell the story of Roger Federer, who I think is another profound example of this, who is well known for his dominance in tennis, but also for his longevity. Federer was absolutely, utterly dominant at age 36 and 37, which in tennis, at the time at least, was insane. This is a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Now it's more expected because Federer set that expectation. But what people often gloss over is between age 32 and a half and 36, Federer didn't win a thing. He was injured. He's a dinosaur. He's dropping out of tournaments left and right. And Federer's got this beautiful quote where he says, like, pretty early on in that process, I realized that, like, the way I was doing things wasn't going to work. I was getting older. And I kept trying to come back from an injury the same way that I did when I was 28. And I need to change my approach. So he reinvented many aspects of his game. Like, he learned this one-hand slice backhand that took a lot of speed off the ball to literally slow down points. Because he couldn't outrun these young kids, but he could outskill them. I think something else that he did that people don't realize the gravity of is he gave up the racket technology that he'd been using to make him the best player in the world in favor of a brand new racket technology that all the young kids were using. So he's someone that went through that period, 3 years of dropping out of tournaments before he had what many would say is the second best season of his career. He won 2 Grand Slams. He was ranked number 2 in the world at age 36 because he changed, he evolved, but he was also very rugged. Like, he held on to his values of excellence and competition. But he changed how he trained. He recovered more. I mean, all of these things. So I think that when athletes get this right, they're just wonderful models and examples of the importance for patience in changing and evolving over our careers.
And sort of to bring it together, these two things, Jerry and I had a conversation 6 weeks ago or so with Steve Kerr, and he said one of the hardest things to do is manage for someone like Steph Curry, who has performed at such a high level for so long. How do you help them navigate the changes they have to make in their game and the realization that I can't operate at the same level I did when I was 25, when I'm 35, right? But I can do things differently and use my brain. But he said one of the hardest things is everyone expects him to be 25-year-old Steph. And it's helping athletes manage the societal pressure as well of getting older and feeling like I'm letting people down. And I thought that was a really interesting insight from one of the best coaches in the world of what you do with athletes at that level.
And I think that it's an absolutely wonderful insight. I'm excited. Has that podcast been released yet or no?
That was we did a conference and he recorded that for our conference for us that we just ran 2 weekends ago. So I'll
Yeah, I'd
share
love
it
to
with
hear
you
that.
though. Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
love to hear that conversation. What comes to mind for me there is, again, this notion of core values flexibly applied.
Yeah.
So Steph Curry's core values around whatever they are, I don't know, excellence, family, teamwork, flashiness, creativity is probably, if you asked him to do basketball core values, I'm sure creativity would end up on the list.
You know what his number one is? Joy.
Joy. All right, there you go.
That guy has fun.
So like you can still do that, but it might be different. The joy might not be, beating someone off a first step and shimmying and shaking baking. But joy might be is a senior citizen in a locker room. But it's still joy in basketball.
Yeah.
So those core values, I really think, are like what gives us ruggedness and stability during times of great change. And I think that's really true for athletes because, you can say this is what makes me who I am as an athlete. And no one says what makes me who I am as an athlete is the fact I go 3:58 for the mile. And if they do say that, that's a great coaching opportunity.
Yeah.
No, it's not. What is it about 3:58? Is it flow? Is it the executing of the process? Is it being a fierce competitor? Because as you age, those things don't change. How you apply them changes, but the underlying value is there. You don't lose that.
Yeah, interesting. All right, we're coming to the end of our time here. We didn't really get to rugged and flexible actions, but I think we've kind of touched on it throughout all of this. So I just wanted to give you like a last chance. Any other sort of closing thoughts or final thoughts for listeners of the podcast here? Any idea that you want to leave them with? And then we'll tell them how they can find the book.
Yeah, I think that just this notion of, I guess, these two main things, right? That allostasis is a better orientation mindset worldview than homeostasis. It is literally more accurate. Homeostasis has been around forever and old myths die hard, but allostasis is now like the accepted approach to change. So stop trying to get back to order. There's only reorder. As a Buddhist would say, impermanence is the nature of reality. As a scientist would say, allostasis is the name of the game. And then the second thing I would say is it's not rugged or flexible. It's not agency or surrender. It's rugged and flexible. It's agency and surrender. And holding those two things at once over the course of your career as a coach, as an athlete, is just so freaking valuable. And I guess since we didn't get to it in too much detail, in rugged and flexible actions, the two main things in that book, in that chapter of the book, are responding, not reacting, which is so important. Just creating space between stimulus and response when things change. And then the importance of patience and how like we are meaning making creatures. And if we are focused on the path, if we do, not think those false peaks are going to be the final peak, but we're really focused on the climbing itself, meaning and growth and all that good stuff comes as a result. We don't have to force it. It's going to be there as we walk our paths.
Yeah, lovely. Well, where can people grab this book? And then also, how can people connect with you directly, follow your work, website, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the book is available wherever you get books. It's on Amazon, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble. Hopefully your independent bookshop has it. If not, you can ask them. It's in hardback, audio, ebook, all the formats. And then the best place to follow my work is at my website, which is just my name, www.bradstulberg.com. And then the social media platform that I'm most active on is Instagram, where my handle is @BradStulberg.
Perfect. Awesome. We'll put all those links in the show notes. Again, the book is Master of Change, How to Excel When Everything is Changing, including you. Brad, thank you so much for your time. This is a great conversation. It's a great book. It's a great read. And the personal development space and the peak performance space. So thank you for this great contribution, and thanks for being on the Way of Champions.
Thanks for having me.